Thank you. Well, good morning. Today is the day we kind of, in a sense, bridge between Thanksgiving and Christmas. Although, when you think about it from a Christian perspective, it's really a smooth transition, right? I mean, Thanksgiving, we've got so much to be thankful for because the Bible tells us every good and perfect gift comes from above. So ultimately, we're thanking the Lord for so many of the blessings that we have in our life. And the ultimate blessing is being the gift of his son, Jesus, which is now what we're ramping up toward during December, celebrating Jesus is coming into the world and everything that entails. So it's a good day. It's a good day, sandwiched in between Thanksgiving and Christmas. I want to start the message off today by asking you a couple of questions, just to kind of get the ball rolling in your mind a little bit. How many of you have had an opportunity to see these guys, these giant redwood trees? Yeah? Okay, so, we got close to, maybe just a tad under 40% at least, or 50% that raised their hands. This is Northern California. I took this picture a few years back on a motorcycle trip to Northern California, primarily for the purpose of seeing the redwoods. And I'm always so inspired, and especially riding on a motorcycle. You've got the panoramic view all around, nothing obstructing the view. Redwood trees are just, any way you stack them up, they are impressive. Some of these trees are over 360 feet tall. And just to kind of put that into perspective, or something that maybe we can wrap our mind around a little bit better, think of a 35-story skyscraper, big, tall building, 35 floors to it. Okay, well, that's how tall these trees, a number of these trees are. Their diameter around the base or not around it, but through it, the diameter, not the circumference, is 22 feet. They're pretty wide. And those of you that have been there, and maybe some of you have seen the couple of trees that it's illegal to do this now, but back in the day, they cut a big square opening and cars could drive through. And how many of you drove through one? Colette and I did that one time, and they're just and perhaps what is most impressive is when you stop and you realize that back when Jesus walked on earth, some of these very trees that are still standing and still alive in California, they were around then. Because some of these trees are over 2,000 years old. And I don't know about you, but when I reflect on something like that, redwood trees, I'm just like thinking in my mind, that's impressive. That is so impressive. All right, well, let's kind of shift gears. Something else. We'll see if we have as many hands go up on this. How many of you have had the opportunity before to walk on top of an aircraft carrier? Okay? All right, we've got a number of people. There's 20, 25 people that raised their hands to this one. This one is the USS Lexington. It's at dock. It's basically a museum now. Corpus Christi, Texas, and quite a few years ago when Colette and I were heading down that direction, it was like, hey, we need to see this while we're down there. Never been on one before. Obviously, had seen movies and the like about them. And let me just say, in a single word, impressive. I mean, you get up on the deck of this thing, and just the sheer size of it is just amazing. But it's when you go underneath the deck that, you halfway prepared yourself for the size of it when you were up on top of it, because you see that part of it in movies. But we walked through most of it under the deck. And that was the part that I wasn't as prepared for. And it was just incredible. They say that one of these aircraft carriers produces enough electricity to supply a small city. And by definition, what that means is a small city, 150,000 people. That's how much electricity is produced with one of these aircraft carriers. Pretty amazing. You go in there and they've got everything from a barbershop to a surgical facility to just pretty much anything that you could think of. One of the things that just really kind of shocked me when I read it about this particular aircraft carrier, and maybe it was true of most of them from back in that time, is that it is said that there are five, let me check my notes, make sure I'm remembering this correctly, 5,000 telephones was on this aircraft carrier. And that it just, I mean, you can Google it for yourself to double check those figures, but it just, when you start thinking statistically, some of the stats, regarding this, it's amazing. When I first moved to Illinois, it was back in the mid-'80s, and we had an older fella in our church, Ralph was his name, and Ralph, during World War II, he was on an aircraft carrier that sunk in the war. And then he was appointed onto another one. It sunk in the war. And then they put him on a third one. And I was just waiting for, how's this one end? And, well, the war got over during that time. And I was like, man, they weren't learning much, were they? Sticking you on one after another like that. But, boy, just to sit and hear him tell stories of what it was like out at sea in the middle of everything. It's hard to come up with a word other than impressive, right? I got one more picture I want to throw up there. This one involves an individual that ever since I was about this big I've looked up to. And if I would have ever met him in person, I would have been looking up to him as well. You'll recognize him. Some of you will anyway. He's right in the center of the picture. There are several people here, but here it is. Okay? Anyone know who that guy is? Yeah, Andre the Giant. Now, this is when he was a little slim and trim. He only weighed like 460 pounds when this picture was taken. Most of the time that he fought in the World Wrestling Federation or whatever, part of that he fought in, he actually was over 500 pounds and 7 foot tall. I mean, this guy was so big, his shoes were size 22, and his hands were so big that if you took his ring off, you could pass a silver dollar through the ring. That's how big his fingers were. And the guy was just a monster of a man. And on top of that, he was a great actor. I mean, he's the one that helped make one of the 5 best movies of all time, one of the 5 best movies of all time. You know which one I'm talking about? The Princess Bride. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of got a sissy name, but the movie does. But the movie actually is really good. And if you haven't ever seen it, you really need to. And you'll agree with me. Andre's the one that makes the movie, such a top-notch movie. He really is a funny guy. So, but, when you think about that, in the World Wrestling Federation, they put out these statistics, and, of course, you don't really know how much of it is fact and how much isn't, when it comes to some of that. But they said that he went 15 years and never lost a single bout. And then he ended up losing. And some of you, and this is probably the saddest part of it all, some of you will remember exactly when this was. You might even remember where you were at the moment. In WrestleMania 3, he got beat by, anybody? Hulk Hogan. There you go. I knew some of you would remember that. Yeah, Hulk Hogan beat him. So, but anyway, you look at a guy like this, right at 500 pounds and 7 foot tall and just a monster of a man. And this is one of those free-for-alls that, last guy standing in the ring, would win it all. And, the only time someone else could ever win it is when they all ganged up against him. at the beginning and threw him out. Otherwise, he always would win something like that. But you look at something like that and you can't help but think, man, that's impressive. Just sheer size and all. And that's kind of the way our mind works sometimes, is we get swept up in the thinking that big things are impressive. We think along those lines, that when something is big, I mean, it's a big deal. It's impressive. It's important. We don't necessarily think that way about little things, at least not as frequently. Because little things, well, they're kind of a dime a dozen, is kind of what our thinking, or at least our subconscious thinking, is. And we can even carry some of this kind of thinking over into the spiritual realm as well. Say you're in the middle of a conversation with someone and you find out, and maybe it's a coworker or someone you're really meeting or getting to know for the first time, and you find out they go to church. And you're just like, oh, I got something in common. And so you ask them, well, what church you go to? And then they give the name of a church, and it doesn't ring a bell for you. And so your next question is, well, what size is that church? And they respond by saying, oh, the church probably runs about 150 to 200. And your response would be something like, oh, really? Wow. Well, that's so cool, and the conversation carries on from there. However, if it had been a conversation where you find out that this person that you're working with goes to church, and you get to the point, you ask the question, what church? Even if you don't recognize the name, you still ask the question, well, basically, what size is the church? And if they responded by saying, well, I think the church right now is running about 3,000 in attendance, what's going to be your reaction? Whoa! Wow, really? I mean, that's kind of the impact that mega churches can have on people, is they get impressed just by the sheer size of it. Or let's say, for example, a Bible study. Okay, let's talk about more in-house. You've got a friend here in the church that you haven't talked to for a number of months, and you strike up a conversation while you're eating a donut, and they say something like, oh, yeah, I need to go talk to so-and-so. They're my small group leader. And you say, oh, you're a part of the small groups? Yeah. And they say, well, how big is the group that you're in? And they say, well, I think there's about 8 of us, 8 to 10 of us. And you're like, oh, okay. And so it registers, and maybe you say a few encouraging words and then part and go your way. But let's say the conversation goes along where you bump into a friend you haven't talked to for a few months, and you find out they're in a small group, and you ask, oh, really, what group is it? Well, we're the group that's studying Mark right now. Brad Fogel is leading it. And it's like, oh, really? Well, how big is that group? And then the response is, and we've got some people in here in Brad Fogel's group, don't we? Anybody want to admit to it? All right. There had to be hands going up, because the size is like 35 people that are in this small group. Okay, I'd put a little asterisk by small there, because that's kind of like a small church that you guys got going there. 35 people that are in this, and we hear 35 people in a small group. Wow. And we just automatically, because that's the way our minds seem to kind of be wired. We talked to someone who is in the church, and somewhere in the conversation, they will say something along the lines that, I try to serve the Lord. I feel like it's the least that I can do in view of what he's done for me. And so you ask the question, what area, what ministry are you serving in? Well, I take regular opportunity to work in the nursery. And we think, oh, well, cool, good for you. And in our mind, we're thinking, better you than me. But no, we're thinking, like, good. Well, good for you, okay? But if that conversation had gone this way, that we find out that they're involved in ministry, and we say, oh, really? Well, what kind of ministry? And they say, well, I try to at least 2, if not 3 weeks every year to go on the mission field, to go to Haiti, or to go to, a mission in Africa. And all of a sudden we're like, whoa, really? You see, it's bigger for some reason. This is kind of the way our minds are wired. When it's bigger, it's more impressive. At least that's the way we commonly think. And my whole point here today as I'm starting the message is we got to be careful about that. Because the reality of the matter is it can lead us down a path that isn't the most healthy path. We are in the third message of a 4-part series that's entitled, That's Impressive. The last 2 Sundays, we've been spending a good amount of time talking on a 4-verse passage of Scripture found in Mark chapter 12 about a little widow who went into the temple and dropped 2 pennies into the offering. She would have just blended in the background. No one would have noticed her in the hustle and bustle because this was one of the feast celebrations. And so there would have been a lot of out-of-towners there too. So it wasn't just regular traffic that was going on in the temple. It would have been jammed with people. And the likelihood is no one would have even noticed her or the offering that she gave. But the reality in the text, Jesus noticed. Jesus was impressed. He immediately called his disciples while she was still within eye-shot distance, and called them over and pointed her out to him and made sure they were aware of what she had just done. Because flat out, even though the word isn't used, it's pretty clear in that text, Jesus was impressed with what he saw. And that goes very different than what it does for us. Because even if we were aware of how much different people give, I would really doubt very many of us would be very impressed by someone throwing a couple of pennies into an offering, okay? You can go back and listen to those messages. But I'm not going to re-preach them here today. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a topic that Jesus clashed with his disciples on multiple occasions. This wasn't just a one-time thing. It wasn't just 2 times. You find it happening multiple times in the Gospels. He had a bit of a problem with the way that they were looking at things. They were looking at some things from a typical perspective as far as what people tend to do, but Jesus was looking at it very differently. And probably the best verse in the Bible that's not even found in the Gospels, but it helps boil down what the fundamental problem was, the disconnect that Jesus was having with his disciples. It's found way back in the Old Testament, 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 7. It says, "But the Lord said to Samuel, 'Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him.' The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Now, to really appreciate that, briefly, you need to know what the storyline is. God had instructed Samuel to go to Jesse's house to anoint who was to become the next king of Israel, because God had rejected King Saul because of some of his issues. And so Samuel shows up at Jesse's house, and the first and the oldest of Jesse's sons walks into the room. His name is Eliab, and Samuel immediately thinks, this has got to be the guy. Whoa, this guy's impressive. He's got to be the guy. The reason God sent me here. But then that's when the Lord speaks to Samuel's heart and says this, don't consider his appearance or his height, for he's not the guy. I've rejected him. I'm not looking at the same things you are looking at. You're looking at the outward side. I'm looking at the heart. And you know how that passage ends up? It ends up with each one of Jesse's sons kind of file by until eventually the youngest of the bunch comes, a fella by the name of David. And the rest is history. Because you know about King David, the shepherd boy that became king, defeated Goliath, all of that kind of stuff. But you see, God was looking beyond the surface, and he was looking at the heart. And that's part of the disconnect that in today's passages we're going to be looking at that Jesus was having with the disciples. What I'm referencing, like I said earlier, is found in multiple passages. So I'm going to show you probably 4 or 5 different passages. Here's one of them. Mark chapter 10, verses 13 and 14. It says this: "One day some parents brought their children to Jesus so he could touch and bless them. But the disciples scolded the parents for bothering him. When Jesus saw what was happening, he was angry with his disciples. And he said to them, 'Let the children come to me. Don't stop them.'" Okay? Seems innocent enough here, but the disciples didn't want Jesus being troubled by children. The word used for children here in classical Greek is a reference to kids that are 7 years and younger. So we're talking about, everything from babies up until, second grade or somewhere in that neighborhood. We're talking about small children. But the disciples wanted to run them off because they just saw them as being underfoot, and they were interfering with more important things that Jesus needed to be doing. Here's something similar that was happening, and Luke records in the 18th chapter of his gospel. It says some people were even bringing infants. Now, this is a different word that is used here, and indeed, it is talking about infants. It's babies that are being referenced here. People were bringing babies to him so that he might touch them. But when the disciples saw it, they rebuked him. See, it's a different occasion, but it's basically the same scenario is playing out again. The disciples saw these guys as getting in the way of more important matters. Basically, this is a reference to something that did happen. It wasn't unheard of. In fact, it was fairly common for people to bring their children to rabbis in hopes that the rabbis would lay a hand on them and bless them, pray for them. And that's basically what people are doing here in regards to Jesus. Only with Jesus, this is extra special because Jesus is no ordinary rabbi. He's described as being one who taught with authority. He's described as one who is curing leprosy and giving sight to the blind. And he's doing things that people had never heard of before. And so to have the opportunity to have your child blessed by someone like that, this was something people were jumping on. The disciples wanted nothing to do with it, though. As soon as Jesus blessed 1 or 2 kids, automatically a line began to form because word was starting to get out. And the disciples wanted to clamp down on that just as quickly as possible because Jesus had more important business to attend to, and that being teaching, and that being healing. They couldn't allow Jesus' work to be interrupted by mere children. So they were determined to put a stop to it. And they were telling parents, back off. Who knows? Maybe they even made a sign. Kids, stay away. I don't know. But, they just didn't want that happening. It's not that children weren't valued. Okay? Let's be careful not to swing the pendulum so much that we're thinking that, none of the disciples had any value at all for children, and that's why they were behaving the way they were behaving. Because that would be incorrect to think that. Children did have value, but the typical way of looking at it is your children had value. The children in your family, they had value. And they were special to you. But in society as a whole, children were largely ignored. They really weren't given a whole lot of adult attention, generally speaking. They were to be seen and not heard, that sort of a thing. You can argue that the disciples were well-meaning in what they were trying to do, because I think their intentions were good, but from Jesus' perspective, they were missing the point. And then an opportunity presented itself. The disciples had a question for Jesus. And this is another one of those passages where all this happens, only this time we're given more detail. And so I want to spend the balance of our time now in Matthew chapter 18. because this passage really does get to the heart of the matter. On several occasions, the disciples were having arguments with one another. They had an ongoing debate with one another. They thought they were keeping it quiet away from Jesus. They were having their discussions and their arguments with one another, but that Jesus wasn't being drug into it. And Jesus was aware of it, but they thought they were doing a good job of keeping it quiet. But eventually they get to this time and they just decide, all right, let's let Jesus settle this. In fact, this argument continued all the way up until the final full day of Jesus' life. The day that he was arrested, the next day he was crucified. I mean, earlier that day of his arrest, the disciples were arguing about this very topic. So it was something that during Jesus' earthly life was never really resolved in their mind. And it was part of because of the way they looked at things. It was so ingrained within them. But here's what I'm talking about briefly. Jump over to this passage. Luke chapter 9, verse 46. It says, an argument started among them as to which of them might be the greatest. That was the ongoing argument. And I think that very much plays into the whole children thing. That's why I'm linking these passages together, because I think it was really at the core of part of their problem here. And so what we have in Matthew 18, verse 1, is the disciples see an opportunity to let Jesus settle this once and for all. They've been trying to keep this hidden from him, that they have been arguing about this, but finally now they're going to pour it out in front of him. And so they asked for him to clear it up. Who is the greatest in the kingdom of God? And perhaps part of what was spawning this argument again on this day was that earlier in chapter 17, we have the story about the transfiguration of Jesus that took place. Remember that story? Where Jesus went up on the mountain. He went with Peter and James and John. And something very spectacular, miraculous happened. They were allowed to have a glimpse at the glory of Jesus. And they saw something in brilliance that was just, it was hard for them to even keep their eyes open, but just a glimpse of Jesus' glory. And at that very moment as well, Elijah, the great prophet of old, appears. And Moses, the lawgiver of old, appears. And Elijah and Moses are talking with Jesus, and they're talking about the soon-to-come suffering that was going to happen in Jerusalem. Okay, that's all found in the earlier part of chapter 17. Well, Peter, James, and John were there. Jesus took them with him. And as soon as that moment plays out and Jesus starts going back down the mountain, he has some very clear instructions to his disciples that went with him. He says this, don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. Now, I don't think these guys really understood what that last phrase meant. The Son of Man has been raised from the dead. They were probably thinking of at the end of the ages, the end of time. But what Jesus was referring to was something that was going to happen in the near future, after his death, crucifixion, his burial, and his resurrection. That's what Jesus is talking about. So I don't think the disciples really got that last phrase, but they did understand the earlier part of it. Don't tell anyone about this, okay? Seal your lips. Don't be talking about what you just witnessed up on the mountain. And you can just imagine, the thing that probably happened as Peter, James, and John join all the other 9 of the 12 apostles, and they're all just like Peter, James, and John are whispering to one another, and the others are like, hey, well, what happened? What happened? Well, you guys were up there. So, oh man, you should have seen it, but can't say anything about it, don't ask anymore, and it's like, oh, come on. And so they asked the other James, or they asked they asked Peter, because everyone knows Peter has an open mouth all the time. So Peter, what happened while you're up there? It's like, oh, I'd love to tell you, but eventually I will, but I can't right now. Been sworn to secrecy. And these guys, they were probably eating it up, these three that had this special privilege and opportunity. But they were told they couldn't tell. They couldn't tell anyone else. And maybe that is part of what sparked this new chapter of them debating about who's the greatest. Because Peter, James, and John thought, we got another reason why we're greater than everyone else, because Jesus let us in on something special that no one else knows, and we're not supposed to tell them. So here we have the question being asked. After all that happens, the question directed to Jesus is, who is greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Because these guys, they're human beings. And human nature really hasn't changed a great deal. They're thinking that greatness is measured by power, position, big stuff, right? You can see, like I said, you can see James. You can hear James perhaps arguing that we were up on the mountain and we saw some things you guys haven't seen. Or you could hear Peter maybe saying, as they were debating who's the greatest, saying, do you guys remember when Jesus said, who do you say that I am? And that's when I responded by saying, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then Jesus said, whoa, flesh and blood did not reveal that to you, but my Father in heaven did. Who did he say that to? Does anyone remember? Well, he said that to Peter. And so maybe Peter was rubbing their noses in that. Or maybe Peter, was saying like, can I have a show of hands? How many of you have ever walked on water? Okay. We know Jesus did, but has anyone else here ever? Oh, yeah, that's right. I walked on water. And then, you can see one of them, Bartholomew or someone say, yeah, but you started sinking, don't you remember? And Peter said, those first two steps, though, it's pretty firm on the water. It was only the third one I started sinking. But they're all debating their credentials, perhaps, that qualifies them for being considered the greatest. I mean, Peter, because of the stories that are told, Peter could have said, remember that time he told me to go fishing and I got a coin out of the fish's mouth and I paid my taxes and his taxes? I didn't pay any of you guys' taxes. Yeah. And so they're looking at all of this, and they're probably sizing up one another. They're comparing themselves with one another, and they're building up arguments as to why they should be considered the greatest. But the reality of the matter is Jesus knows true greatness has nothing to do with walking on water or getting a glimpse of Elijah and Moses or many of those things. So they ask the question, who is the greatest? How is Jesus going to respond to that? The reality is he doesn't respond immediately with words, not directed toward them anyway. He responds with actions. The very next verse, that he called a child to him and had him stand among them. Now, this perhaps was seen as being a little bit odd. Okay, we got a question on the table. Why are you avoiding the question, Jesus? It's like we just asked who's the greatest. And you're inviting some child. We don't know who the child was. They were in Capernaum, and that's where Peter's home was, so maybe it was one of Peter's kids. We don't know, and I don't know as that really matters. But Jesus took a moment or two, called a child, and had the child stand right in front of him, in front of everyone else. All these disciples are sitting on the edge of the seat. They just asked this question that they had been debating now for nearly 3 years. Who is the greatest? And Jesus is kind of doing an object lesson with them by bringing a child, and everybody's attention is focused on the child. And then Jesus says this in verse 3. I assure you, Unless you're converted and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Remember the question he's answering. Who is the greatest? Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus is drawing everyone's attention to a child. And he's saying, unless you are converted, that word literally means changed, unless you are changed to become like children, you're not even going to get there. It would have really been a statement that would have been a head scratcher for some of them. For others of them, maybe they were a little sharper and they were connecting the dots right away, and they were thinking about all the times they ran off all these parents of babies and stuff like that. And it's like, wait a minute. Is he referencing kind of a theme that has been developing now for 3 years? You see, Jesus here is making it clear with this object lesson that greatness really doesn't have anything to do with outward appearance. I mean, let's pick on Bartholomew again. We never talk about him, and he's kind of got a cool name, right? So let's say Bartholomew is the tallest of all 12, and he's pretty buff, okay? You know, and he likes to wear short sleeves all the time, so he can remind everyone of how in shape he is. Well, part of the point that's being made here is your appearance, that really doesn't play into it. Greatness. Because Jesus is now saying, well, unless you become like a child, you're not even going to get there. So Bartholomew's impressive appearance, well, that's not it. Achievements, maybe a couple of them have several achievements. Maybe Peter would list all of his references to how, he had several opportunities to do some encounters with Jesus. Maybe he would consider those being achievements. No, it's not those kind of credentials. Maybe net worth. Maybe Matthew still had a pretty good-sized nest egg from his days of being a tax collector, because he would have had a lot of money going through his hands during his day before Christ. And so maybe he still was well-to-do. No, it doesn't have anything to do with that. Social position. No, these guys were common people, fishermen and the like. Political position. No, not many of them had politics as a very big part of their life. And swinging to the other side of it, Jesus obviously wasn't talking about wearing diapers, right? When he said that. He wasn't saying that you need to start sleeping in a crib to be great. You need to start sucking on a bottle. No, because the passage isn't saying that we need to become children. It's saying we need to become like children. So as you think it through, in what way is there greatness in a child? What can we learn from children? We, as you well know, Colette and I have had the opportunity to have another crash course over the last couple of years of having a close-up look. And right now I'm tempted to show you about 12 slides of my grandson, Bo. But if I do that, I feel like some of you will want equal time. So we don't have time for that. So I won't do that. But we've had an opportunity the last couple of years with Bo. And Bo is a hoot. I mean, he is so fun. Colette, like some of you that have grandkids, Colette watches Bo a couple of days a week. So some weeks it might be 3 days, but it's always, it seems like, 2 days a week. One of those days is my day off, and so I get to be around him all day. And he is a blast. Now, I got to say, I am totally shot at the end of the day. Sometimes, 8:30 that night, I'm going to bed because I am just so worn out trying to keep up with him. But he is so fun. He's all boy. He Avengers. I mean, he's all about that. And you can just imagine what his favorite Avenger is. It's Hulk, right? So anytime you try to play any game where it's building, a little tower and dropping a marble, I forget what that's called. We got one of those kind of things, and shoot, you don't ever get about 2/3 or 3/4 of the way done. Next thing you hear coming from the side, Hulk smash, boom, everything just crumbles. And he's always Hulk smashing something, and he just loves to do that. But it's refreshing my memory of some of what is so special about little children. Besides the fact of the funny expressions and the silly things they say and stuff like that, there's some other things. Perhaps like the fact that little kids are teachable, right? Some of you think of your grandchildren. Some of you think of your children. You've got them in your home right now. And you know how teachable they are. They want to learn. And you can sit down and you can teach them new things. And I mean, it's, you can tell Bo's been around cell phones, these smartphones, because sometimes, he'll grab my cell phone and I don't know how he opens it, but he opens it somehow. Gets past a password, and the next thing I know, he's in an area I've never seen that screen before, and it's like, man, give me that back, let's, and then, when a text is coming in or something, a little window, a notification or something pops, he immediately knows what to do with that. He just swipes up, and it's just like, how did you learn this stuff? You're only like 20 months old. How did you learn this stuff? But that's the nature of little kids. They're teachable. They are eager to learn. And as great of an attribute that is, and even a biblical concept that holds value, I don't think that directly is what Jesus is talking about in Matthew 18. Now, there might be some overlap, but I don't think it's the main thought here. Another thing about little children I think about is how trusting they are. Little children, they serve as, I think, the greatest examples of what trust looks like. And I can even remember back when my boys were real small, and we kind of had this ritual type thing that we would do when I would change their diapers, and we had this changing table, and it wasn't one of these fancy changing tables that has ledges, around it. It was all flat surface, and it was just hard floor underneath. And you lay them down there, and you're changing the diaper, and it's not even like today. You don't throw those diapers away. How many of you remember what you do with those diapers? You put them in a pail or something, and you get the fun later of, kind of makes you want to wash your hands again, doesn't it? It's like, we had cloth diapers. In fact, some of the rags I use in my garage today are still my boys' diapers from way back when. And so here, I'm changing their diaper and putting the plastic pants, on them over the top of the diaper. And they knew what was coming next, because as we got closer and closer, they'd break out in a big smile. And I'd say, now, just sit there up against the wall on that changing table. And I'd drop the dirty diaper in the pail and all. And then I'd stand them up. I'd take a couple steps back, and I'd squat down, and I'd look up, and I'd say, jump. And without any hesitation, they always did. No hesitation. It's one of those things that one time, it was like, whoops, teach you sucker, No, you never did that. You never did that. I wasn't going to let them fall flat on their face and get a bloody nose every time I caught them. But every time it was also a demonstration of trust. They had no hesitation. Now, we don't have a changing table at our house nowadays, and we just sit down on the floor and change Bo's diapers on the floor. But we still get opportunities because we have split level. We've got several sets of stairs in our house. And Bo, when he's coming down one of those steps, and I might be down there, and I'll say, hey, Bo, let's go outside, or Bo, let's go play with such and such. And whatever step he's at, he'll just look at me, and he'll just jump. fully trusting that I'm going to catch them. And that is a characteristic of little kids that has incredible value as far as setting an example for us. But I don't even think that's directly what Jesus is talking about in Matthew 18. I think there might be some overlap here, but I think what Jesus is referencing is something else, and it's because of the very next verse. Verse 4 says this. Jesus says, "Therefore, whoever humbles himself like this child, this one is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." Yeah, what we're talking about here is humility. Now, it takes humility to be teachable. It takes humility to be trusting. I mean, that's where I say there's some overlap with these concepts. But ultimately, what Jesus was referencing here, unless you become like a little child as far as being humble, you will never enter into the kingdom of God. In Luke's gospel, this particular story that is recorded in the opening verses of Matthew chapter 18, it is found right at the tail end of a short parable that Jesus told, the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector that went into the temple to pray. Remember that? The Pharisee went in to pray, and he stood there and he prayed, "God, I'm thankful that I'm not unrighteous. I am not an adulterer. I am not a sinner. I'm not like that guy over there. Instead, I fast twice a week. I tithe 10% of everything that I receive." Okay, that was his prayer. And then as Jesus continued with the story, he says, there was the tax collector, and the tax collector was standing there, and he would not even lift his eyes up, and he was beating his chest, and he was saying, "God, have mercy on me, the sinner." And in the Greek, not all translations do this, but in the Greek, the definite article "the" is found there in the text. This tax collector, he was not all caught up comparing himself with others like the other guy. He was not saying, "Well, God have mercy on me, I'm one of many sinners." He wasn't saying that. He wasn't making any comparisons. He was just saying, "God, have mercy on me, the sinner." And then Jesus says, who do you suppose went home justified that day? Yeah. It was this guy who humbled himself. And it was immediately following that Jesus goes into talking about what real greatness looks like and how we need to humble ourselves. Do you want to go to heaven? I think the answer to that's pretty clear for everyone that's gathered here. Do you want to be great in the eyes of the Lord? Then the reality of the matter is, you and I both, we need to admit that we cannot accomplish it on our own. That no matter how hard we try, we cannot pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. We cannot be good enough. We will always fall short. We will always miss the mark. The reality of the matter is we need to acknowledge our dependence upon Him. This is where it all starts. Sometimes people, the whole focus that they have in a Christian setting is that, well, you need to pray the prayer. You need to pray the sinner's prayer, or you need to be baptized, or, they focus on all of that kind of stuff. The reality is it all begins with this, humbling ourselves. A recognition of the fact that your goodness is not good enough. And the sooner we get to that recognition, the better. As long as pride has a grip on us, we're always going to think that we can do it on our own. But the reality of the matter is, you cannot do it on your own. And I cannot do it on my own. No matter how hard we might devote ourselves to good deeds, no matter how many rotations we might take working in the nursery or teaching down the hallway in the kids' classes, no matter how many mission trips we might go on, no matter how many times we might read through the Bible, you will not ever score enough points to earn your salvation. Because the reality of the matter is you have missed the mark, and so have I. And that, by definition, is what sin is. It's missing the mark. And we're all in that boat, and that boat is sinking. You and I, we cannot do it on our own. This is why this is what God needs to see in our life. And I'll use an Old Testament passage because the reality of the matter is what God is looking for that helps define greatness is something he's been looking for all along. Psalm 51, verse 17 says, the sacrifices of God. These are the kind of gifts that God wants. It's a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. Oh God, you will not despise. That has everything to do with humility. Us humbling ourselves. As long as we are thinking that we are self-sufficient, as long as we are holding on to our independence, then we will always fall short. God is holy. And if you want to spend forever with him, you need to be holy. And you've already blown that. And so have I. But that is the reason Jesus came into this world. And as we're ramping up to Christmas, we need to know that there was a purpose behind Jesus' arrival. It wasn't just to make nice songs about away in a manger and stuff like that, but rather he came for a purpose. He came to do for us what we could not do for ourselves, and that was ultimately to pay the penalty for sin so that we could be forgiven and we could have the hope of eternity. That's what the gospel is all about. But as far as you embracing that and receiving that into your life, you need to become like a child. And that all starts with humbling yourself and saying, I can't do it on my own. Lord, I need you. I need your help. That's where it all starts. Our ushers are going to be getting up at this time and preparing for our time of communion. And while they are preparing for that, I'm going to ask if you would bow with me and we would pray as we prepare our hearts for this time of communion. Father, thank you for this morning and for the opportunity to talk about a topic that doesn't come natural to us, because we tend to be like Peter and James and Matthew and Bartholomew and all the rest. We tend to compare ourselves with others. We size ourselves up compared to others and somehow hope that we're going to score a little higher, and if we do, we're good to go. But the reality of the matter is, Lord, as you have reminded us today, it doesn't work that way. Father, we are sinners. We acknowledge that. We've missed the mark. But we love you. And we want to spend all of eternity with you. Thank you for providing a way that could happen through sending your son Jesus into this world for the purpose of paying the penalty for our sin. Though he was sinless, he paid the penalty for our sin so that we could receive his righteousness. Our slate could be wiped clean. While we take the bread and we eat it in the cup and we drink it, we're reminded of the body and the blood of Jesus, the sacrifice that was made that made it possible for us to have the hope of eternity. And we celebrate that hope. It's in Christ's name I pray. Amen.